Welcome to Unscripted with Jeff Pedowitz. I sit down with remarkable people from very different worlds, security and science, business and medicine, technology and the arts, for honest conversations about AI and where it's taking us. No scripts, no talking points, just what they actually think. I'm Jeff Pedowitz. Let's get into it.
My guest today spent years as a philosophy professor teaching ethics. Then he left the academy to do something almost nobody does. He makes Fortune 5000 companies actually operationalize inside their AI. He's advised Amazon, the FBI, and the Canadian government. He wrote the book, Ethical Machines, and he has zero patience for the hand-wavy version of AI ethics. So I wanted to push on the real question underneath all the corporate talk. What does taking AI ethics seriously actually require, and who is just faking it? Reid, welcome to Unscripted. Let's get into it.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
You got it. So you've been practicing, you've been in this field for a long time. I'm just curious, is there a belief about your field that you've changed your mind about recently?
Oh, that's a good question. Is there something I've changed my mind about? Well, I guess it's sort of big. The way that we do whatever you might call it, AI governance, AI ethics, responsible AI, blah, blah, blah. I think that the way that we do that is fundamentally broken. The truth is that I didn't really know how to do it when I came into this field. I learned a lot from risk professionals that I'm friends and colleagues with. They taught me a ton about what risk management looks like in large organizations. And what I came to believe is that it's actually not the right way of doing things. And so we can talk about what that standard, what I now call the standard approach is. But I think that the short version is what changed was, here's how to do AI risk management or AI governance or AI ethics. And now I think, nope, that's not true at all.
So can you provide maybe one specific on that? Like what's one thing that you would have thought you should have done it this way, but now, no, you're doing it very differently?
Yeah, it's very policy driven. That's the sort of one main thing, top down policy driven. So you write a policy, it gets alignment across the C-suite, you get eventually board approval of it, and then you spend the rest of the time implementing the policy. And then the idea is, of course, if you implement the policy, which is to say people comply with the requirements of the policy, you'll have done a good job mitigating the risks, avoiding the nightmares, stuff, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's just the wrong approach. There's a lot of problems with it, but if you want me to give you just one big problem, it's the pace. It is catastrophically slow. So in a large organization, a Fortune 500 company, if you want to pass an enterprise-wide policy, you're looking at about a year. I think the fastest I've ever done it is something like 10 months, but it's usually over a year because you're writing this policy. My team and I can draft a policy in the matter of a couple of days, but the working group weighs in on it, and then people outside, that working group weigh in on it, the various C-suite stakeholders. It's got to get on the board's agenda. The lawyers get involved, so you're looking at least a year. And now, this policy gets passed and nobody cares. Nobody.
It's almost in many cases obsolete, right? At least at the pace that AI is moving.
There's at least two problems. One is that no one cares about it and you got to spend all this time implementing. And the second is that you wind up implementing an out-of-date policy because, as we all know, AI is moving so fast that you pass your policy on narrow AI and then generative AI comes out. You pass your policy on generative AI and then AI agents come out, and so on and so forth. So you're playing this.
So you're saying where it should be bottom up, like let the employees just kind of drive the right behavior?
No, I wouldn't say that either. I think that there needs to be a different method of introducing or implementing AI governance where and when it's needed. So, there's a couple lessons that we learned from the rejection of the policy approach, which is it can't just be top down. I like the joke that it needs to be middle out as a friendly nod to the show Silicon Valley. I don't know if you ever watched Silicon Valley.
Yes, good show.
Yeah, so the middle out approach. So I think that what we learned is that it can't be policy driven, can't be compliance driven. It has to be something that can be rapidly implemented, that doesn't have this really long design phase. And so then that's what I designed in my new book. So you mentioned Ethical Machines at the top of the show. That was my first book. My second book is The Ethical Nightmare Challenge. And in that book, what I'm doing is I'm developing...
Okay, got it right here. I'll give you a plug. Yeah.
There it is. What I do in that book is I develop a different system or a method for introducing AI governance when and where it's needed. So we have our clients getting set up with engaging in legit AI governance in a matter of weeks instead of months and years.
So, and that you're seeing this happen in real time with a Fortune 5000 company?
Yeah, so we're piloting now. The idea is that once the pilot goes well, then we scale. I won't, BS you, I'm not a BSer. It's early days. The book came out 2.5 months ago. So, the truth is that I didn't have the method before I wrote the book. I figured it out as I wrote the book, as I spend the first roughly half to 3/4 of the book sort of laying out all the problems with the standard approach and the complexity of the AI risk landscape. I eventually came to see what the conclusion needed to look like. So it's early days, but yeah, we're seeing very good signs of early success, or early signs of good success.
Do you view from a governance framework businesses should take the lead, or is there a role for a federal or state government to play here in crafting more pragmatic policy, I guess?
Yeah, the short answer is that I don't know the answer to that question. I've advised, you mentioned that I advised the Canadian government on their federal AI regulations, and government is no different than a Fortune 500 company in this respect. They're very, very slow. The EU AI Act, for instance, European Union AI Act,
Yep.
They were on the verge of passing it, and then all of a sudden ChatGPT came around, and they thought, oh my God, this doesn't cover generative AI. They had to go back to the drawing board. And so they did that, and then they ultimately passed it, and now AI agents are a thing, and it doesn't really cover that well. So, does there need to be some kind of regulatory standards? Yes. It's very hard for me, though, to see exactly how they should pass regulations in such a way that it's going to be sufficiently timely. So let me put it slightly differently. I'm less concerned about the content of regulations, where I think there could in principle be very good regulations. I'm concerned about the method of devising and implementing, so to speak, or enforcing, because it's all painfully slow and too slow for the technology.
And I know this is really early, but given that there's much talk about the future of work and how AI is going to change how we operate, could your approach really be applicable towards any aspect of the organization as they're rolling out all different kinds of policies in an age of AI, but companies are going to be changing rapidly. So not just AI specific policy, but all different kinds of ways of running the business.
Yeah. So to be clear, I'm not I'm critiquing the policy first approach. I think policy is a tool among many for avoiding the worst of AI. And in this context, it's neither the most efficient or the most effective. In other situations, sure, policy all day. But for AI, I think it's the wrong approach. And for really technology generally, I think it's the wrong approach, because the technology is getting more and more complex. The risk landscape is getting increasingly complex. We're going to start seeing more and more interconnectedness among emerging technologies. So AI and blockchain, and AI and mixed reality, and AI and quantum. And so if we just sort of keep trying to spin up policies for each one of these things and all the ways in which they intersect, we're dead. So yes, the method that I design in the book and that we're working on with clients is intentionally flexible in at least two respects. One is the scope of technologies that you consider. So while officially it's called, the Ethical Nightmare Challenge, and I focus on AI risks, the method is really tech agnostic. So it could apply to quantum or blockchain or mixed reality or quantum AI or blockchain AI or whatever. The second way in which it's very flexible is the scope of risks. So what I recommend is creating these they're kind of like, I can get more into the detail, but the very, very short version of it is creating these sort of AI risk SWAT teams. And the SWAT team has a very clear mission. It's to avoid the nightmares of AI. And the scope of risks is officially up to the ENC team, or up to, what the ENC team needs to cover. So in some organizations, it'll make sense for them to include, for instance, cyber risks in addition to ethical, reputational, and legal risks. In other contexts, it won't make any sense for that ENC team to deal with cyber risks. So as the technological landscape evolves, changes in various complex ways, the method is meant to flex to those changes in technology and risk landscape and risk mitigation tools, so on and so forth.
So when you're walking into these big companies, what would you say is the most common ethical blind spot that you're seeing when you're starting with a new client for the first time?
Non-culpable or somewhat non-culpable ignorance. They just don't know. I'm not blaming them. For a lot of these people, it's not their job to know, or it hasn't been their job to know. But I think that most organizations don't understand the risks of AI, and especially agentic AI. They do have some broad sense of something ominous going on when you tell them, hey, listen, we're going to connect AI to a bunch of databases and a bunch of enterprise software and let it rip. You know something's wrong. But they don't really have a good grip on what the risks are and what you're supposed to do about them. And so for me, the most important thing, at least as a sort of first step, is to get everyone on the same page. We don't have people speaking the same language when it comes to AI. We don't have people with a shared understanding of what AI is or what the risks are. And when you don't have that shared language and shared understanding, it's impossible to have collaboration. And if AI agents call for anything from a sort of person-first perspective, it's collaboration across departments, across expertise.
You know what I find fascinating about that? I mean, I could definitely see in a smaller business, because you're trying to run, your sophistication or sense of various risks are lower. You're in a global 5,000 company, you're public, you have all these compliance, all you're doing is managing risk related to your share price, your shareholders and so on. And you have all these regulatory bodies. So why do you think, though, given that culture of managing risk as it relates to at least AI, they're so unaware?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know the answer. I mean, here's my hypothesis. It's that non-technologists are intimidated by the technology. That you talk about this was especially true before agentic AI, but when you talked about AI and the risks of AI, people were like, "Oh, I don't know. I don't know about AI. Like, that's technical stuff. That's for the data scientists. That's for the computer scientists. I don't really get that stuff. But, I'll use it for emails and generating summaries of reports, but I don't really I don't know. Understanding and managing the risks. That's really for the techies." And I think that is born primarily of a fear that they won't understand it. That, look, I'm a CEO, or I'm a marketing officer, or I'm an HR, and I'm not a techie. I don't think I'm going to understand this stuff. It's not for me. And I actually think that is disastrous ultimately, because we're not going to be able to manage the risks appropriately unless we have the insights of people from HR, people from marketing, the people who are going to use these AI agents, who are going to deploy them, who are going to oversee other people using those agents. I think they need to understand what this stuff is. And we need their expertise to contribute to how AI is developed. Because if we don't have their insights into how things can go wrong from their perspective, the data scientists don't know how it can go wrong from the HR perspective, or the marketing perspective, or the chief medical officer's perspective, et cetera, et cetera. And so we need them to be involved. So again, my hypothesis is something like they're intimidated by the technology and think they won't understand it. But I think that's the wrong view to take. They've got to overcome that intimidation and figure out how to get educated in a way that speaks to their level of expertise or lack of expertise in AI generally.
So, because your background is really fascinating. I mean, all those years that you taught moral philosophy, and so now you're looking at embedding ethics within corporate systems and corporate AI. What is it about your background as a philosopher that allows you to see these things differently than the engineers and the business leaders and the people that are already doing these things?
So there's a couple things. One is that, I'm a trained philosopher. My PhD is in philosophy. I was a philosophy professor, as you said, specializing in moral philosophy or ethics. One is just that we're systems thinkers. Philosophers are systems thinkers, because the whole thing that we do is we try to get a grip on what's the big thing going on here. And then we're really good at understanding all the parts of the whole and how all the parts relate to each other, and how if you push on this part, it's going to affect these other three parts, and so on and so forth. So we do that from, if you like, an argumentative perspective or a conceptual perspective, but it's the same kind of thing when you're talking about the systems of, let's say, risk management. Oh, I can see how all these things fit together and how this moves that. And so, we're sort of trained up to be systems thinkers in some broad way. That's one thing. Another thing is that I'm really good at spotting BS. In the ethics space, there's a lot of people who sort of come into this ethics, AI governance, responsible AI space who don't know a damn thing about ethics. They don't hesitate to proclaim themselves AI ethicists or governance experts, but they don't really know anything about ethics. And then they start talking about things like trust and fairness and privacy, and they don't really know what they're talking about. And it's less about me saying I am the all-knowing sage of philosophy and ethics, and here's how you ought to do this, and here's how to think about it. And it's more like, oh, no, you're actually just going down the wrong path. So I think a lot of people go down a lot of wrong paths because they don't actually know how to think about things like fairness and privacy and hallucinations and blah, 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 all the various kinds of risks associated with AI. And I think that not knowing which paths to go down is phenomenally valuable. And I think a lot of people just don't know which paths to not go down because they're new to ethics and thinking through ethics and thinking about how to think about ethics. And that's the way in which it's been.
So I think we see that too internally, right? For years we had values like every other company has values, right?
Yeah.
I think we started to reflect on it. Like the value was just say integrity. That can be a very abstract concept, like what do you mean by integrity, right? So we ended up a few years ago, we put in behaviors to start to codify, like, well, okay, specifically, this is what we mean by integrity. Like when you do this behavior, this is a good behavior, this is a bad behavior. Is that kind of what you mean? Like when you run into someone that spouts out words, they're not able to really articulate the next level down of how they would actually implement it?
That's certainly one of the things. Yeah. I don't think they have, I just think that a lot of times they're just moving around words that sound good. So there's like, oh, we're really committed to, this will be like principle number 3 or pillar number 3 of our program. We're really committed to ethics and fairness. And I want to say, what do you mean ethics? Fairness is a subset of ethics. What do you mean and? So these are clearly just people throwing out the word they think they're supposed to throw out without any sort of conceptual understanding of what's the relation between ethics and fairness. Because ethics and fairness is in some broad sense kind of redundant. It doesn't, I think they're just saying these words because they're buzzwords that they think they should say without understanding what they're actually meant to say. And because they're just throwing out buzzwords, there's no way of connecting it to action.
So then given that, then how do you actually operationalize at a big company when they're probably thinking, well, of course we want to have trust and fairness and governance in our AI system. Why wouldn't we? But then how do you get down to that next level where it really matters?
Okay, so there's a couple of things to say here. One is that there's the standard way of doing it, which is the way that I practiced for 8 or so years and wrote about in my first book. And I think it's all wrong now. And then there's the way that I suggest now. So the standard way is frankly exactly what you said earlier about connecting it to behaviors or procedures. I would say procedures. So what is it to be, what does our commitment to fairness amount to? It means we're going to engage in these, 5 to 10 procedures. We're going to identify potentially discriminated against stakeholders at each stage of the AI lifecycle. We'll mitigate the biases against those people at each blah, blah, blah. What does transparency amount to? Well, we're going to tell people whenever they are interacting with an AI. And so you get these procedures that are connected to those values, and that's then you can measure, hey, did people do the things? And you can measure compliance with the procedures. Okay. And that's some kind of progress. I think it's not terrible. It's a decent start, or it looks like a decent start, but I actually think it ultimately fails for a variety of reasons. I'll just highlight one of them now, although I can go into much more detail. So one of the problems, it comes when we talk about AI agents. The thing about AI agents is that they are so context specific. So who's using what AI agent for what purpose in what context? That agent, to what tools is it connected and how does it call on those tools or use those tools? All that varies wildly from agent to agent. And if you have, let's say, 20 procedures that sort of, if you like, fall out of your values statement, something like, these are arbitrary numbers, but 10 of those procedures are going to be relevant to your agent. 10 of those procedures will be irrelevant for your agent, and it's going to be just checkbox compliance stuff. And then there's another 10 procedures or things that you ought to do for your agent that aren't on that list at all. And so the thing is, what this says to me is having a generic list of procedures or behaviors, as you said, that we just apply, so we stamp on every single AI agent use case, is just fundamentally misguided. It fails to appreciate just how complex and context sensitive, and if you like, snowflakey, all these agents are. So then the second thing it says to me is, well, what do we need to do instead? Well, what we need to do instead at a very high level is engage in problem solving. What does this agent need versus that agent need? And so what I recommend, the ethical nightmare challenge, is don't start with your values, which invariably, if anything, get translated to these lists of behaviors or procedures. I want you to start with the really bad things that can happen with this agent. To speak slightly fancy, the failure modes, the ways they can go really bad, the nightmares. Tell me what the nightmares are, and then let's figure out for this agent, what kind of resources do we need to avoid those nightmares? What kind of training do our people or end users need in order to use those resources effectively? If you can tell me what the nightmares are and the resources and the training needed to avoid those nightmares for this agent, I think you've done your job. And that's fundamentally a problem-solving endeavor, not a compliance endeavor.
So, for example, a problem would be we accidentally expose our financial systems and data, and it gets out into the public, right? Or our employees sense the data, or customers' PII data gets exposed, and do something with
that. That's a little bit high level. I mean, if we're talking about a particular AI, I mean, that's the way that, let's say, a department or an enterprise perspective might say, the sort of that very abstract thing. At least at the project level, we want something more specific. So, for this AI agent, we're connecting it to databases about our customers' financial information. And we're also connecting it to an email server. And we want it to email internal documents, about people's financial, whatever, profiles to blah, 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 blah. What would be a nightmare situation if it actually accidentally sent an email to, some external person that contained such and such financial information about our clients? That would be a disaster. That's a little bit more concrete than leaked data. We know this agent's connected to emails. We know it's connected. It has email addresses and it has financial information. We know sometimes it makes mistakes. What's an obvious mistake it can do? It can email the wrong person. Maybe it even emails the wrong person internally. So, it used an email address of @fortune500.com, but it went to this person rather than that person. It went to Brian Johnson, whose email is brjohnson@fortune500.com, when it should have gone to B Johnson, Barry Johnson. And so Brian got access to this very sensitive information they shouldn't have had access to. Right? So I want the nightmares to be a bit more specific than just, sort of generic data gets leaked.
So do you use the nightmare to help a business decide not to do something? Because I got to imagine the competing pressures in a Fortune 500 company are huge against what you're trying to do. You're trying to get them to stop and slow down. So how do you actually convince them? Do you have to make the nightmare like big enough of a
I don't. I'm not there to tell them exactly what their nightmares are and how to prioritize them and what their risk appetite is. That's their call. My job is to give them the method. My job is to say, you've got this really hairy, complex risk landscape in front of you. You've got AI on everyone's phones and computers and tablets. There's shadow AI. You're going to develop it in a variety of ways. Different departments are going to use it in a variety of ways. You need a method for dealing with the risk. So the method is the frame is this, there's more to say, but the ethical nightmare challenge is identify your nightmares, tell me what resources you're going to use to avoid those nightmares, and tell me how you're going to train people to use those resources effectively. When we get into the sort of more details, more in the weeds, there's a 7-step method for scoring and prioritizing nightmares, and then making decisions about, given what resources we've developed, have we sufficiently reduced the risk such that we feel safe or comfortable deploying this AI? I give them the method. I give them the way that they can have someone from risk and someone from data science and someone from the HR, let's say it's an HR solution, to have a conversation together, even though they have very different kinds of expertise. So we give them a method that those different stakeholders, they have a structured way of answering these questions and recording it in a shared worksheet. But what they score nightmares and how they deal with those scores, that's their call, not mine.
Well, I mean, I think certainly within that lexicon, right, and a nightmare could be at least codified and made more objective if you describe the outcomes that could occur.
Well, nightmares that's one reason why I like nightmares. They are articulations of bad outcomes. Right? A nightmare scenario and a bad outcome are synonymous. And so we have...
because I'm just going back to the typical business executive. I think we were talking about this earlier in the conversation, where they don't know what they don't know. They're dismissive. They don't understand it as tech. You're coming in and you're saying, look, this can be very concrete in your world. Here's the bad things. And that's what makes ethics objective, not subjective. But you got an executive that's thinking otherwise. They might pay lip service to it. Like, ethics, schmethics, it's just all crap. So is the nightmare the main utility vehicle that you're using to help them see that, hey, it's not just a pie in the sky. This is what can really happen?
Yeah, so I don't get involved in teaching them about ethics being objective or subjective. I actually did talk about that in my first book. I don't think it's necessary at this point. they have to be organizationally relevant nightmares. Ethical, reputational, legal, somewhere in those categories. And you could have an executive say, look, I don't care if such and such happens, but our shareholder sure as hell would care if it happened, and that's why I care. I don't think it's unethical. I think it's fine, but in this day and age, lots of people think it's really unethical, and they'd be very upset about it, and our shareholders would be upset about it. So that's a nightmare situation for our organization. So if you like, the level of objectivity they need is not about thinking about ethics as objective, but about thinking about what outcomes would be really bad for the company, for the organization, and that they're perfectly capable of doing. That's one thing to say. The second thing to say is that, so what the method of answering those 3 questions with the 7 steps is done or performed by ENC teams, Ethical Nightmare Challenge teams, and those are crucially cross-functional teams. So even if that executive or that person, that project level person, can't see the potential nightmares, the marketing person can, or the HR person can, or this. So one reason why it's so important to have these cross-functional teams answering these 3 questions is because they're going to see different things. They're going to see nightmares that somebody else might see. The data scientist, I think I said this earlier in the conversation, the data scientist who's creating an HR solution might not understand the HR landscape well enough to understand the various ways that things can go sideways. But if they're talking to the HR person, then that person can say, yeah, listen, we got to watch out for, situations X, Y, and Z. And then this is the second reason why it's so important to have them collaborative. They're going to offer different things to avoid the nightmares. So for instance, the data scientist is going to do RAG to reduce the rate of hallucinations, but not take it down to 0. The HR person is going to figure out where and when to put a human in the loop so that outputs are vetted for truth. The data scientists by themselves can't bring the risk level low enough. The HR department by itself can't bring the risk low enough. But combined, their collective contributions bring the risk low enough such that deployment is safe.
So there isn't really any one owner, right? It's stewardship at the company level that everybody plays, or most of the employees play a role.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's different ways to structure this. So here's way number 1. Way number 1 is the ENC team does their work. They fill out the worksheet. They're scoring nightmares. They're prioritizing. They're developing the resources, the training, blah, 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 blah. They rescore. They say, yes, this is cool to deploy, or no, it's not cool to deploy. Way 1 is now some executive looks at it, reviews it, maybe has a conversation with them and says, yes, I greenlight this. I'm the accountable one. Here's option number 2. The ENC team has over time proven itself to be very capable. So we are now, we're going to, if you like, just like we would with an AI agent, we're going to, now that this ENC team has proven itself over time, we're going to give them more autonomy, so to speak, more authority. And now ENC teams can directly greenlight deployment of AI. Which option do you want to go with? I think that option 1 makes sense out of the gate. I think option 2 makes sense as a future level of maturity. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so.
You can say no. I mean, it was a question about accountability. I think accountability, look, one thing that is happening now is that people are trying to make, and this is the standard approach, they're either trying to make a single executive wholly accountable, which is kind of impossible because these systems are so complex, this executive can't possibly know all the ins and outs of the AI. Or they're putting all the weight on a risk board. So not the ENC kind of thing that I'm talking about, but a centralized risk board that when things are noted as high risk or flagged as high risk, that risk board tries to figure out how to make this sufficiently low risk. This is not scalable. And so accountability is supposed to rest with the risk board. It's not scalable because as corporations adopt AI more and more, and when we're talking about agents, we're almost automatically talking about high risk use cases. They can't do all that. So the only plausible solution for scaling AI is pushing more responsibility, more accountability onto that front line on the condition that you've given them the education, the tools, the method for them to actually carry that stuff out appropriately.
Well, I also think, given the unprecedented nature of AI, we can't solve tomorrow's problems with yesterday's approaches, right? I think in some ways we do have to think differently, adapt differently, because our companies are going to look very differently. within the next few years. We're going to need different skill sets, different outcomes. There's going to be different org designs and models. And I just don't think we're prepared for that as leaders or as managers. And, it's going to be as much change as we've seen, I think, in the last few years. We haven't seen anything yet,
I agree, although we might disagree about timeline. Adoption is slow. I don't care what the numbers say. Adoption is slow for large organizations, but I think that's totally understandable. I think that's probably a good thing. So you might think it's more like in the 1 to 3 year. I don't know. You tell me what you think. 1 to 3 years, we're going to see massive change. I think more like 5 to 10 years is when we're going to see upheaval, because I think it's going to take a lot longer than anyone anticipates to actually integrate this technology in a way that's really disruptive to the way that we do work, organizational structures, et cetera.
I think it's about 2 to 3 years predominantly, because we're already seeing, in a lot of ways, we got past the easy part. Let's make it more efficient. We can use this as an excuse to get rid of some employees and cut labor costs. Of course, the irony is that we're going to now spend way more on tokens and tech costs than we did on saving on the labor. But we're just getting to the part where actual work starts to change, roles start to change. It's not just a matter of doing things more efficiently. Yeah. That's like the step one. We only got a couple minutes left, so I'm just, moral philosophy has been around a long time, 2,000-3,000 years, something like that. Uh-huh. Is there any one main principle idea that you wish every AI builder understood?
No. Not really. I'm sort of, like I said, I could talk about ethics, moral philosophy all day long. I taught it for, 15 years. I wrote research on it for, 10, 15 years. But I don't think that sort of high moral philosophy is particularly relevant. Maybe at the societal level, maybe at the regulatory level, maybe if you're sort of thinking like, how do we rethink social political structures, blah, blah, blah. Okay. But if we're talking about Fortune 500 companies, honestly, I think it's what are the nightmares? So in the book, I say, we shouldn't be trying to sort of chart a path out of Plato's cave here. This is not, that's not sufficiently pragmatic. And while I am a philosopher, I'm also a business owner, and I'm an impatient person, and I just want to get stuff done. And so to me, it's forget about the highfalutin principles and the theories. Just tell me let's figure out where the icebergs are and figure out how to steer away from them. That's it. Tell me what the worst case stuff is, and let's make sure we avoid that stuff. Okay.
So is there one thing that you're paying attention to right now that you wish more people were, or that they're not?
I don't think they really understand just how insanely complex the risk landscape is. That AI agents really are game changing. That the risk becomes exponential. It increases exponentially. The jump from narrow AI or traditional machine learning to generative AI was a pretty big step. Generative to agentic is a freaking mountain. And I don't think people get that yet. They don't understand. They sort of have a vague grip on risks related to autonomy. I don't think they really have understood cascading failures in agentic systems. They haven't understood systemic or emergent risks in agentic systems. I think they still think about agents as these coherent entities, like you're just talking to another person, but it's an AI instead, as opposed to seeing it for what it is, which is very complex engineered systems that are roughly analogous to commercial jets and Navy ships and nuclear plants. We're talking about LLMs connected to any number of tools, dozens of tools with all these skills, with all these methods or ways of connecting to those things, all the order in which it calls on those tools, how it uses those tools. It's connected to the freaking internet and pulls information from the internet. So it's exponential, and I don't think people are paying enough attention to that yet.
Well, we could indeed keep going for hours, but we're out of time for this episode. But Reid, thank you so much, man. Appreciate you being on the program.
No, thanks for having me, man. Always a pleasure chat.
And then real quick, for people to get your new book, The Ethical Nightmare Challenge, where can they grab it?
Online, anywhere. Amazon, Target, Walmart, Barnes & Noble, all those places.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Reid Blackman. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jeff.